Good morning and welcome to Inquirer Live, Worldview with Trudy Rubin. That's me, I'm Trudy Rubin, Worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And today we're going to be discussing the global vaccine mess and the prospects for vaccinating the world. We couldn't have a more terrific guest than Dr. Paul Offit, an internationally renowned expert in the fields of virology and immunology, who really needs no introduction to those who've seen him on CNN and many other news outlets. But just to cite a few facts, he is the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, CHOP, and a professor at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's also a member of the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Board. A few housekeeping details before we get started. I'd like to let you know how to ask questions at any time during the discussion. You can submit questions for Dr. Offit by going to the comments section at the bottom of this page. And if you're watching us on social media, you can join the Q&A by going to inquirer.com/Trudy Live. That's inquirer.com/TRUDYLIVE to submit your questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A session after my discussion with Dr. Offit. So now to get down to it, we've all been obsessed with the vaccine question, why the US rollout is so chaotic and slow, especially in Philadelphia. And today we're going to look at that question, not just from a local or national perspective, but from a more global angle. I am going to discuss with Dr. Offit the challenge of vaccinating the world and what happens if poor countries do not get vaccinations in a timely fashion. But before we get to that part of the discussion, I want to raise the issue of a successful US vaccination campaign as the most important foreign policy challenge facing President Joe Biden. The failure to control the spread of the coronavirus and to plan for the vaccine rollout has deeply damaged America's image abroad as a competent country, as a scientific leader. So how can Biden do it better? And what lessons can he learn from countries like Israel, whose vaccine campaigns are going well? Dr. Offit, let me start by asking you, so far the rollout has been a little rocky, but how would you evaluate how the Biden team has done so far just in the early stages? And why isn't there enough vaccine?
Okay, first of all, this isn't easy. I mean, this virus was published in the journal Science in January of 2020. That's when we knew the sequence of this virus. That was just a little more than a year ago. We were able to take advantage of work that was done by at the University of Pennsylvania by people like Drew Weissman and Catalin Carrico to be able to try and apply whether or not this so-called messenger RNA vaccine strategy would work. I think if you asked 1,000 researchers on the planet Earth in January of 2020, do you think that by November, within a year, you would have two large phase 3 trials of 30,000 or 44,000 people showing that the vaccine was remarkably effective, 95% effective, across all age groups, across all sort of comorbidities, across all racial and ethnic backgrounds, and was safe, at least as far as we knew then, and now that we have tens of millions of people who received this vaccine, we can say it doesn't even have a rare safety side effect problem. I think no one would have thought that was possible. So I'm just trying to sort of focus on some of the good things. I mean, you have more than 180 research labs across the world that were working on this virus. You had more than 100 companies across the world that were working on this virus. You can't just snap your fingers and have like everybody be vaccinated. And as people say in the vaccine world, the hardest part of making a vaccine is making a vaccine, meaning mass producing it, which is not trivial. These are biological products. They're not small molecule drugs like, amoxicillin, where you can easily characterize whether there's 50 milligrams in a tablet. These are biological products. So it's hard to make. But to get to your question, I mean, how do I think that the Biden administration is doing? I think they've picked up where the Trump administration sort of didn't do a good job. I think the Trump administration did a good job at making a vaccine. I think what they didn't do a good job was vaccination. So good with vaccine, not good with vaccination. And this is not a country that is geared toward mass vaccination of adults. So we're learning how to do that, I think. And I think we are learning how to do it, really. It's when the vaccine first rolled out, remember, only about 20% of the vaccine that was distributed was administered. Then it became 30%, then it became 40%, then it became 50%. Most recent numbers at 60%. So we're getting better at mass vaccinating. The problem now is we need to mass produce this vaccine to a much greater extent than we're doing it.
So what are the hurdles to the mass production? I mean, obviously, when the companies were developing this vaccine, they knew if they succeeded, they would have to scale up. But I guess they've never scaled up on this at this level. So just starting with looking at what the U.S. has on order, what are the obstacles to scaling up sufficiently?
Manufacturing space. You want to make sure you have enough space to do this. I think the biggest problem actually is this naked messenger RNA molecule that's used for this vaccine, which is sort of the genetic blueprint that codes for the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. That's not hard. I mean, that's synthetic. We give it, like, depending on the company, between 30 to 100 micrograms per dose. A microgram is a millionth of a gram. You can make kilograms of this stuff. That's thousands of grams. That is a 10 to the 9th fold greater amount of product, which means you can really theoretically inoculate billions of people. The problem is that complex lipid delivery system, that nanoparticle, which encases the messenger RNA, that has never been scaled up before. And I'm sure that is probably where we're having difficulties. If you look at the chemistry behind how to do that, it's not easy. And I think that's probably part of it. And it may come down to the fact that if we don't have enough manufacturing space, if you will, and you want to create more manufacturing space, the only way to do that is with another pharmaceutical company. I mean, these aren't men's shirts. You can't just sort of, take a building and then try and retrofit it to that. It's hard. Only pharmaceutical companies have the resources and expertise to mass produce these kinds of products. And so I don't really know the details. I know that, though, that we are having trouble making a lot of this vaccine.
And so do you expect that this will be the biggest obstacle to vaccinating sufficient people in this country and globally?
Yes, the good news is I think there are other vaccines around the corner. I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, and so we will be looking at Johnson & Johnson's vaccine on February 26th. If past this prologue with the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, then if our committee does recommend it, then it's been about 5 days before it started to roll off the assembly lines, which would be around March 3rd or so. And you have the AstraZeneca vaccine, you have Novavax's vaccine. So those are two more vaccines that are also probably right around the corner. And so the more the merrier. I mean, the more manufacturers that are involved in this, the better chance we have of getting on top of this.
And just in terms of the Biden administration and showing that America can do it, and America does not become the whipping boy for the Chinese who are full of Schadenfreude, that they are able to, by authoritarian means, get their vaccine out and can force people to take it whether or not they want it. So just in terms of the Biden administration, what are the 2 or 3 things you think they need to do in order to do the best they can to get that vaccine into arms when it becomes available? Is it more federal funding and resources? Is it a national distribution plan? What is it?
I think it's a series of local distribution plans. So for example, Rachel Levine, when she was Secretary of Health here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, had a plan. She knew what she wanted to do. She knew, for example, in rural areas in the central part of the state, she wanted to set up immunization clinics. She knew how many people lived there. She knew how much it would cost for her to set that up physically, as well as in terms of personnel. She needed to have a better relationship with the federal government to tell them what she needed, when she needed those doses, and how much money it was going to cost to do all that. I think that the Biden team is now starting to do that, because each district and locality is different in terms of what their needs are. I mean, some areas like the Philadelphia, in theory, should be pretty easy. We have a lot of hospitals, we have a lot of pharmacies, we have medical schools around, we have the technology that should make distributing the vaccine easy. Certainly at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, it is a well-oiled machine for how we give that vaccine. I mean, it's great. We do, 30 people 12 people every 30 minutes. We have a variety of sites where this happens, and it's pretty well oiled, but we're a hospital, so we're used to giving vaccines. But, in the rural parts of the state, this may be harder, but there has been a lot of tripping and falling here. I think we're learning as we go. We're up to about 1.35 million doses a day in the United States. I think if we can get to 2.5 to 3 million doses a day, I think we could then have enough vaccine to immunize everybody who needs to be immunized so that by the summer we should be able to get on top of the virus.
Wow. So do you think in Philadelphia, I can't resist asking, that the hospitals will soon be called on to be part of the administering bureaucracy?
That's going to be up to the people who make that decision locally and then at the state level. I'm not involved in those decisions.
Right.
I think that's what it's going to come down to.
Right. And just one other question. I know this isn't about the vaccine per se, but one of the problems in this country, parallel to poorer nations not getting vaccinated, is that poorer communities and communities of color are not getting vaccinated sufficiently. Do you have any thoughts on how those communities can be better served? Is it a distribution issue, a communications issue? Should there be better use made of groups of Black professionals, Black doctors, like the Black Doctors COVID Consortium in Philly?
No, sure. I think that we have earned the distrust of the Black community over the decades, and we need to re-earn that trust. And I think that what breaks your heart about this is that the Black community, when they're infected with this, are more likely to be severely infected, more likely to be hospitalized, go to the ICU and die. So that they especially need these vaccines. And there has been some distrust there. And so how do you regain that trust? I think you regain it through groups like the National Medical Association, which is the oldest medical association in the United States, composed of African American physicians, whether it's religious leaders in those areas. But we need to do that. It's interesting, though, just as an aside, there have been two African American women who've been on national television recently who both made the correct point. They said, if you look, why pick on us? If you look ask a variety of groups the question, will you get this vaccine? Or definitely, or will you definitely not get this vaccine? The percentage of African Americans who said they will definitely not get this vaccine was 14%. The percentage of Republicans who said they will not get this vaccine was 25%. Yet we never talk about them. About how to influence them. I think that is part of it. I mean, I think it's part of the whole past administration's cult of denialism, where if you're going to deny the importance of masks, or deny the importance of social distancing, or deny the fact that this virus exists, you're not going to be so quick to get a vaccine. So it is, I guess it's a political thing where on national television, I guess we don't like to talk about how it's Republicans that also tend to refuse this vaccine.
So in essence, what you're saying is with Black community and probably other people of color, it's outreach is the problem, making it easily available. Whereas with partisan politics and anti-vaxxers and distrustful Trump supporters, is that going to be the trickiest wicket in getting America vaccinated sufficiently?
Yeah, I just think I think for the Black community, it's not just a matter of getting access to the vaccine. I think it is also a matter of trusting that vaccine. I was just, had an accident where I actually sort of cut the area over my eye. So I got like 12 stitches here over my eye. And I was in a Cape Regional Medical Center getting stitched up early in the morning. And the one by one, the nurses were going to get their vaccine, and an African-American phlebotomist came to bleed me, to get blood and for testing. And I said to him, "So are you going to get the vaccine?" He said, "No, I'm not going to get it." I said, "Why not?" He said, I don't want the vaccine that they're just giving to Black people. And I said, there actually aren't two separate lots of vaccine, but he just wouldn't believe it, which tells you how much distrust there is in that community. And we just have to get better at this. I think we can. I think we have to find who those influencers are, because it just breaks my heart to think that group would choose not to get a vaccine when they're at high risk.
Israel has vaccinated more than 1/3 of its population of 9 million with the Pfizer vaccine, and nearly 2 million have received a second dose. And the UK has vaccinated over 15% of its population, although it didn't do so well in containing the disease. The US right now is over 8%. Why is Israel doing so well and the UK pretty well with vaccinations? Are there lessons for the United States to learn?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Certainly Israel made this a priority, as has the UK. I would say we're getting there. I mean, I just think we were slow off the blocks to get there. But, you don't have more than 30 million doses that have been administered in the United States. You have 53 million doses that have been distributed totally. You have, I think, more than 7 million people who've now gotten their second dose of vaccine. So I do think we're getting there. I just think it's been a slow learning curve. And I do think the past administration pretty much just threw their hands up with regard to the vaccination part. And they just figured that, they'd made the vaccine, so we're good. So I think the Biden team sort of started in a hole, but I do think they're trying to do all the right things, especially in providing money to make sure that people can set up these mass vaccination sites.
If we turn to the global threat, poor countries are being left behind. The director of global delivery at the Gates Foundation says that by the end of 2021, probably 75% of high-income countries will be vaccinated, compared with 25% of low-income countries, and that there won't be enough vaccine for true global coverage until 2023 or even 2024. What impact will it have on ending the pandemic if large parts of the world lack vaccine? Will that encourage the emergence of dangerous new mutations?
Well, I don't think we need any more information to know that what happens in one country affects the world. I mean, witness this outbreak in Wuhan that ultimately brought this world to its knees. And it's another example. I mean, we continue to give a polio vaccine in this country. Why do we do that? We haven't had polio in the United States since the late 1970s, at least not naturally occurring wild-type polio virus. We do it because there are still two countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, where that virus is endemic, because international travel is common. And that with polio, like with COVID-19, a lot of the transmission is asymptomatic. Most people who are infected with polio virus are shedding the virus and not knowing it because they're asymptomatic. So do I think people with polio virus walk into LAX airport or walk into LaGuardia every year? Yes. And if we let our guard down far enough, you could see polio come back in this country. And I think the same thing will be true with this virus. You're only as strong as the weakest country. So this is a global problem. It has to be handled as a global problem. The sort of America first notion does not work here. The viruses don't recognize international borders. They're going to cross anyway. And so we need to do that. I think that this virus is going to create mutants. It is. It's a bat coronavirus. It is adapting itself to the human population, and as it adapts itself to the human population, it will create variants. That has to happen. And so the way variants come about is when you have generally poorer immunity. So we need to have excellent vaccines that get out there as quickly as possible to try and kill this virus rather than just wound it. Because if you wound it, then it has the capacity to escape and form variants. We need to kill it as quickly and efficiently as possible.
We have a question from the audience about, was it the drug company's responsibility to develop a fair system of distribution by country, or is this just a free-for-all, whoever orders first or puts the money into advance financial commitments gets it?
Well, I think the companies are the ones that have the resources and expertise to mass produce, to make and test and mass produce a vaccine. That's what they can do. I don't think it's their responsibility to figure out how it's most easily distributed. I do think that in a better world, there would be an overarching body that does that. A body like the World Health Organization would then decide, how can we best distribute this vaccine, most equitably and fairly distribute this vaccine, so that we can best have our chance of getting in control of this virus. I don't think that's the company's responsibilities per se, no.
There are international organizations that are supposedly working on distributing the vaccine worldwide. One of them is COVAX, in which the World Health Organization is involved, and 150 countries have signed up, but it's short both of vaccine and funding. At the same time, critics have pointed out that many rich countries, including the US, have options on an amount of vaccine that's larger than they would need to vaccinate their population more than once. So do you have thoughts on how you get sufficient global supplies of vaccine out there? Does it take altruism on the part of rich countries, more contributions of funding to COVAX? Is there a formula that could be pursued?
Right. So I'm a virologist. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. But I mean, in a better world, again, you would have a group that is like a United Nations of countries that have the capacity to mass produce vaccines, to make sure that things are being distributed as equitably and broadly as possible. I mean, the good news about the mRNA technology, just as an example, is it's given at 30 to 100 micrograms per dose. A microgram is a millionth of a gram. I mean, the mRNA can be scaled up to make kilograms. I mean, that's thousands of grams. That's a 10 to the 9th fold difference. That's a billion-fold difference. So you can make, in theory, billions of doses to vaccinate a population that's a little over 7 billion in the world. You could do that. And now you have these other vaccines. I mean, the vaccines, for example, in China or Russia or the UK, the other sort of groups that are doing that. But there is sort of as you allude to, a nationalistic element to this, that the countries will make vaccines for their country and for their allies, is the sense that you get the way this is playing out, which is really not the fairest way to do it.
Which vaccine is most suited to distributing in the third world? I mean, after all, if Pfizer requires special equipment for freezing, but AstraZeneca, as I understand it, is cheaper and more easily distributed to poorer countries. What is the outlook for there being a vaccine that's not only available for poorer countries, but can be handled effectively within their systems?
Right. Well, so the perfect vaccine would be a vaccine that induces a high level of protection, is safe, is refrigerator stable, and refrigerator stable for months, and is given as a single dose. I mean, you could argue right now that would be Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. I mean, that hasn't been approved in this country through emergency use authorization, but likely will be out there by the first week of March. I mean, that could be it. But again, it boils down to how good these companies are at mass producing their product. I know the AstraZeneca UK collaboration have often talked about how they saw themselves as the vaccine for the world. But there's been a lot of tripping and falling with that particular product. AstraZeneca are doing a trial in the United States now. I think when that trial is completed, then our committee and the FDA will review those data to see whether or not we would agree with recommending its use in the United States. But we're not there yet, even though it is being used right now in the United Kingdom.
The question, again, of making enough vaccine for the third world. I have a question here that asks how the Defense Production Act would impact multinational companies. Does the DPA give the U.S. government the authority to order production of various vaccines by companies that are not incorporated in the U.S.? That seems unlikely. But let me ask it a different way. Does the Defense Production Act, is it useful in any way in speeding production of vaccines, since the vaccines that right now the U.S. are using aren't made here?
Yeah, again, not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. I will say only this, that it is hard to make vaccines. It is. It's hard to mass produce vaccines. If you look historically, where there have been times where there have been shortages of vaccines over the last 40 years because there's been a blip in production, and we don't have a lot of there are not that many companies that make vaccines just for Americans. There was in the mid 1950s there were 27 companies that made vaccines. By the 1980s there were 18. Today essentially there are 4 companies that makes vaccines for American adults and children, because it's just not a big money maker. I mean, vaccines are something you give once or a few times in your lifetime. They're not something that you give every day, so they're never going to compete with products like lipid lowering agents or diabetes drugs or psychological drugs, psychiatric drugs. So that's why they've become sort of the poor sister of pharmaceutical companies. And so you're trying to build up an infrastructure in this country, in this world, for a product that's not a big ticket item. And so that's another problem here.
So that's why these vaccines aren't being produced in this country then, because I have a couple of questions asking that.
Yeah, I mean, so Merck makes vaccines in this country. Sanofi makes vaccines in this country. GSK primarily makes vaccines in Belgium, but and Pfizer makes vaccines in this country and elsewhere. But that's not many companies that do that. There were many more companies. Wyeth, Lederle. I mean, there were a number of companies that made vaccines for this country that don't anymore, primarily because it's just not a lucrative product.
When HIV/AIDS was ripping through Africa, eventually the intellectual property rights were turned over by the companies that made the vaccine so that they could be mass produced and distributed. And I guess the US played a big role, the Bush administration, PEPFAR. Could that be done with the vaccine for coronavirus? I know that India and South Africa have been lobbying to compel drug companies to share their intellectual property on coronavirus vaccines, as they eventually did with HIV/AIDS. I know this is not your direct area, but does that make sense from a virological point of view in order to get it out there?
Yes. I mean, the way I see this is that, I mean, why did we make vaccines so fast? How were we able to do this so quickly in the United States? The reason is because we spent money to do it. I mean, the government spent $24 billion roughly, according to the Foundation for Vaccine Research, to do that. They did it because they paid for the phase 3 trials for a number of these companies. Certainly they did for Moderna, for Novavax, and for the Sanofi GSK product. We'll see how those play out. But that's why it's been so fast. They also, they mass produced the vaccine at risk. That was Operation Warp Speed, not knowing whether these vaccines were safe, not knowing whether they were effective. They were willing to take that risk, and that's why it was all so quickly. So I think these companies then owe us something for that. I mean, I think we should have a lot of say then in how this gets distributed. I mean, they were paid to do that, and we are now distributing that vaccine for free. In many ways, it mimics the polio program in the mid-1950s, which was kind of Operation Warp Speed 1, where, again, it wasn't the government that paid for that. It was the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, otherwise known as the March of Dimes. But they paid for the phase 3 trial, the big definitive phase 3 trial. They paid to mass produce the vaccine, and then that vaccine was essentially distributed initially for free to first and second graders. So this is kind of like Warp Speed 2 here. But I do think the government and governments should have a lot of say when essentially it's the taxpayer that paid for these vaccines.
Well, I remember when HIV/AIDS, again, it was ripping through Brazil, it was ripping through Africa. And I remember being in Brazil when the government there was having a huge spitting match with the United States because the Brazilian government decided to buy a generic of the HIV/AIDS vaccine that was being made in India. And there was a huge political to-do over it. But India, with its capacity to mass produce vaccines, you could imagine, I guess, in Warp Speed 2, if the drug companies cooperated, you could have mass production there. And even in some other countries, possibly South Africa could also produce. Might that be the road to vaccinating the world? And does it need to be done sooner rather than later?
I mean, sure. The Serum Institute of India is the largest vaccine maker in the world. They're very good at mass production. Yeah, I mean, and in regards to sharing technology, I mean, you have, for example, China which was one of the first to do this because they had the virus so quickly. The Sinovac has an inactivated vaccine. Grow the virus up, purify it, and then inactivate it with a chemical. I mean, that's a well-worn technology. It's what we use for the inactivated polio vaccine, the hepatitis A vaccine, the rabies vaccine. And so I haven't seen other groups doing that. I mean, there's no reason others couldn't do that. It is a well-worn technology. And the other thing that's very frustrating, this just from my standpoint, is that where are the studies? Where are the phase 3 studies? Where are the published phase 3 studies? I mean, you hear the Chinese say that their vaccine is effective in the sort of low 90% range. And then Brazil, which apparently used that vaccine, say, no, it's more like in the low 50% range. And it's, again, you would just like to see, it's all by press release. I mean, you really would like to see the details of the published studies. And that should be internationally collaborated, an international collaboration. I mean, the Russian data also were just published actually in Lancet a couple of days ago. And that data also looked great, 92% efficacy across the board, across all age groups. And that technology is very similar to Johnson & Johnson's technology. In fact, their first, it's a 2-dose vaccine, but that first dose is Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. Essentially, it's the exact same technology. So again, it's, these things are all being done in a disparate way, in an individual way, and there's not that kind of collaboration that would make mass production and sort of mass distribution across the world much easier. There's a nationalism to this. I mean, China touts its vaccine, Russia touts its vaccine, the UK touts the AstraZeneca vaccine. I mean, they're giving the AstraZeneca vaccine in the UK based on a phase 3 study that would not likely allow it to be used in this country because it was done in such a sporadic and somewhat haphazard manner.
I have some questions here that are more directed towards the situation in the United States. One question here asks about the physiology of delay of a second immunization from the recommended interval. Would there be a decrease in efficacy if the second shot was delayed by weeks or months?
No, I'm glad you've asked that question because this actually is something that has been very upsetting for me. I think that the notion was, here's the thinking behind sort of the 1 dose versus 2 dose strategy initially. The thinking is you have a limited number of doses. So if you have 1 million doses, is it better to say vaccinate 500,000 people with the 2-dose series, knowing that it's 95% effective and knowing that therefore 475,000 people will be protected? Or is it better to just give 1 million doses to 1 million people, knowing that there was some efficacy between dose 1 and dose 2 in those studies that were done with the Pfizer and Moderna products. If you look at the Moderna data that were presented to the FDA, there was about 80% efficacy between getting the first dose and the second dose. And so some people, and prominent people, prominent virologists, prominent public health people, have stepped up on the national stage on places like CNN and Good Morning America and say, just get as many first doses out there as you can. The problem with that is that, first of all you know is that one dose is 80% effective for 4 weeks. I mean, that's all you know. You also know from the phase 1 data where they did the dose ranging studies that one dose has a much lesser capacity to induce virus-specific neutralizing antibodies than that second dose, which gives you a dramatic boost, plus gives you the kind of cells that are detected, so-called T cells that are directed against this virus, that suggests immunological memory, saying that therefore 2 doses will give you better, longer lasting immunity. What worries me here is, now the CDC has accounted for this. The CDC has said, okay, we do have a limited vaccine. We know it's hard to get that second dose now. So you're allowed then to get the second dose 6 weeks later, instead of in the case of Pfizer 3 weeks or Moderna 4 weeks. So you can have a 2 to 3 week play in that, but no more. Because I think what's going to happen is, what I fear is going to happen, and what I am certain is happening, is some people are saying, I got 1 dose. I mean, they're telling me 80% effective. That's pretty close to 95% effective, good enough. Or also, I had some side effects with that first dose. I've heard that the second dose is even worse. I'm not going to do that. I got an email today from somebody from NBC saying that they are looking into the fact that there are a number of people now that are saying they got 1 dose and they're good. Plus, it's going to be more confusing if Johnson & Johnson does get approval through emergency use authorization, which as a 1-dose vaccine. People may say, well, that's 1 dose. The mRNA can also be 1 dose. And that would be a mistake. There's a reason that Pfizer and Moderna launched this as a 2-dose vaccine, because it's a 2-dose vaccine. Some vaccines are multi-dose products. The shingles vaccine, Shingrix, is a 2-dose vaccine. Measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is a 2-dose vaccine. You need that second dose. And I fear that we're going to have a less immunized population with that 1 dose. And worse, you want to kill this virus with high levels of neutralizing antibodies. You don't want to just wound it, because if you wound it, what's going to happen is you're going to have escape mutants, otherwise known as variants. You're only going to increase the risk of variants. This is a 2-dose vaccine. We need to do everything we can to get that second dose out there. But I recognize, and the CDC recognizes, this is a problem. And so they're now saying, in addition, if you've gotten, say, Pfizer vaccine for the first dose, and under exceptional circumstances, you can get the Moderna vaccine for the second dose, even though that's not been tested either. But in some places, they might not have that Pfizer vaccine for a second dose, and the CDC can at least get a second dose with something that's an mRNA vaccine. So it's just really confusing for people, and I worry that people are going to see this as a 1-dose product when it is not. I can't make this clear or strongly enough. It is a 2-dose vaccine.
As you say, there were mixed messages put out over CNN by senior medical people on this. How do you get the message out clearly? I mean, you mentioned South Korea as having a record of excellence in testing and tracing and keeping the disease down. But they had one voice from the beginning coming out in messaging, and it was the head of their Korean CDC. Now you have an administration that cares about science, and you're having briefings with scientists on TV. But is that going to do the trick? When Dr. Fauci talks in highly scientific language, do you need national leaders, influencers? Do you need sports stars out there saying 2 doses? Do you need a jingle? How do you get the message out? Or do you just need to get it out to the states and the medical personnel? How do you get a unified message?
I think what I like about what the Biden administration is doing is that 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they now are having their COVID task force talking. They're the ones who have to get this message out there clearly to the public, to the press, which then is the way that the public comes to understand this. That has to be the best place to do it. I actually think Dr. Fauci is good at kind of de-jargonizing the scientific language among ID people. I think infectious disease people. I think he's been great at it. I think he has a trusted voice, and God knows he puts himself out there. I mean, he's on television all the time, thank goodness. But I do think you're right. I think we need and see, the problem is that when the polio vaccine rolled out, you would have Elvis Presley get the polio vaccine, or Marilyn Monroe get the polio, or Joe DiMaggio get the polio vaccine. There's limited supply right now, so the problem isn't trying to get people interested in the vaccine. I think people are interested in the vaccine. Some people are like making major grant donations to places, hoping that will get them the vaccine. So I don't think that's the problem. I think when we have more vaccine available, we can come up with that jingle idea of yours.
And do you think when we have more vaccine, that's the route to making headway with the anti-vaxxers or the Trumpist distrusters?
I think if you're a conspiracy theorist, which is what anti-vaccine folks are, or what arguably sort of Trump supporters at some level have to buy into this. I mean, God knows much more can we hear about Marjorie Taylor Greene. But so conspiracy theory seems to rule the day. My favorite line on this is Neil deGrasse Tyson's line when he says, if someone reaches a conclusion without using logic or reason is not going to talk them out of it. So forget it. I think that people should be skeptical of vaccines. I think they should be skeptical of anything they put into their bodies. I think they should demand to see the data, demand to see that these vaccines are what they're claimed to be. That's fair. But if data and logic and reason don't work to convince people, then forget it. You're never going to convince them. I don't think the anti-vaccine people represent enough of the population. I mean, the true conspiracy theorists regarding vaccines represent enough of the population that would limit our ability to create herd immunity through vaccination. I don't think that's true. We'll see. We'll see how it plays out.
What percentage do you think is necessary to get vaccinated? I saw you quoted as 70%.
Right. And Dr. Fauci has said that early on, too. I think that's true. There's actually a formula for this. It's based on two factors. One is the contagiousness of the virus, and two, the efficacy of the vaccine. It's a contagious virus, but not nearly as contagious as a virus like measles, which is roughly 10 times more contagious than this virus. And it's highly effective. I mean, it's 95% effective. That's good. So I think if you can get to 70%, I really do think you'd see a dramatic diminution in this disease. I mean, it's not going to go away. It's not like you're going to have no cases and no hospitalizations and no deaths. But I think we'll get to that level where we're much more comfortable.
I have a question here asking, after I get my second injection, Moderna or Pfizer, what is the risk of transmitting COVID to people who've not yet been vaccinated? I think this is what a lot of people wonder, not just after the first, but even after the second injection. Can you still transmit?
Right. So when Moderna and Pfizer did their studies, their so-called phase 3 efficacy studies, they only looked for protection against disease. They didn't look at protection against infection, where you still might be infected, not develop symptoms, but still shed virus and be contagious. They didn't look at that. The UK study recently looking at the AstraZeneca product, and the data were confusing, but it was carried in the New York Times as kind of a breakthrough of 67% protection against shedding. But if you look carefully at that data, I'm not sure you can really say that. In any case, I think that you don't know. I mean, it would be nice to do the kinds of studies with the mRNA vaccines to see whether or not that's true. As a general rule, if you're vaccinated and then you're asymptomatically infected, you probably would shed less virus. I mean, there are a number of vaccines that we currently use in pediatrics that do not prevent asymptomatic shedding. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that created the rotavirus vaccine. That doesn't really prevent asymptomatic shedding. Nonetheless, we've had a dramatic reduction in the incidence of hospitalization and death from rotavirus in the United States among children. I mean, many residents at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia have never seen a case of rotavirus infection, whereas it dominated my residency. So I think you don't necessarily have to prevent asymptomatic shedding as long as you lessen the degree of asymptomatic shedding, which I think would be likely here. In any case, you should wear a mask and social distance until we get control of this virus, period. And just for selfish reasons, remember it's 95% effective. It's not 100% effective. 1 of every 20 people may still get sick with this virus, and you might be that person. So just for selfish reasons, you should still mask and social distance until we get control.
Given your experience at CHOP, I can't resist asking, do you think schools should open?
Yes, this will sort of. I've actually never gotten more hate mail over a short period of time than I went on CNN and I said, yes, I think schools should open. I get an email that says, you sit there in your office, and you can tell us to go back to work. I just like to say, by the way, that am rounding on patients that in our hospital that have COVID when they were just starting to give the vaccine before I'd ever gotten my vaccine. Okay, because essential workers are essential and therefore need to work. I think that we need to do everything we can to mitigate the risk for the teacher. It's really the teacher that's at greater risk. There was a study recently in Wisconsin showing that school settings were actually, there was less transmission in a school setting than in the surrounding community. So that's reassuring. Rochelle Walensky, who's the CDC director, has said, yes, teachers can go back to school without yet being vaccinated, but you're not helpless here. I mean, you can wear a mask, you can physically distance. There are a number of strategies that you can mitigate the risk. And there now is a rapid test for detecting whether or not a child or an adult is infected with this virus. You can know within 15 minutes whether that's true. That's good. So I think, sort of trying to do HEPA filtration to the degree that you can is good. But I think teachers need to go back to work. Meaning, because I think on-site learning is much better than virtual learning, because for some children, certainly in the Philadelphia area, it's the only decent meal they get during the day. And child abuse is often first recognized in the school setting. We do need to get children back to school. Depression is now greater in school children, including small children, because of their absence of being in school. And for the very young child, I just think virtual learning is almost impossible. I mean, with the older, the teenager, the late high school student, it's a little easier, but I think we need to get back to school and get back to. I agree with teachers that they're essential workers and essential workers work. I mean, you have firefighters and policemen and utility people work in utilities and your water purification. They're working without necessarily having been vaccinated yet because they're essential workers like teachers. I would give you my email address to send me hate mail, but people seem to have no trouble finding it, so I'm not going to give it to you.
We can exchange hate mail. It isn't funny, but you have to laugh as long as it doesn't get dangerous. Someone has asked whether you think it's risky to get vaccinated in a pharmacy, or riskier to get vaccinated in a mass setting.
Right. It is certainly true that when you get any vaccine, whether it's the COVID vaccine or not, the risk of severe allergic reactions is about baseline. It's about 1 per million. It looks like it might be higher than that. The Pfizer vaccine currently is listed at 5 per million, the Moderna vaccine at 2.8 per million, and those numbers may come down as more people are vaccinated. But a severe anaphylactic reaction usually occurs immediately, within 15 minutes, sometimes as late as 30 minutes, and needs to be treated immediately with a shot of epinephrine. So you need to be in a setting where that can be done. Now, pharmacists in theory should be able to do that because they've been giving vaccines, a variety of vaccines, for a number of years now, and they certainly have epinephrine there, and hopefully they can give epinephrine because they give the shot, so therefore they should also be able to give an epinephrine shot. But you're right, in a mass vaccination setting, if you're checking into a mass vaccination setting, I certainly would ask that question. They usually they have to ask you to wait around for 15 to 30 minutes, 15 minutes if you've never had a problem before, 30 minutes if you've had a severe anaphylactic reaction before. But ask that question. Make sure that they have epinephrine there and a trained personnel who can give you that shot of epinephrine. That has to happen. It's such a great question.
I have another question about the J&J vaccine. If it's approved and distributed here, is it advisable, since it seems to have a lower efficacy? Is it worth doing? If you have a choice, and how would the U.S. juggle the issue of whether you get one or you get the other? I mean, what would the message have to be?
I think the goal of the vaccine is to prevent you from having severe infection, the kind of infection that causes you to seek medical attention, the kind of infection that causes you to be hospitalized or go to the intensive care unit or die. That's the goal of a vaccine. I mean, we've only looked at preliminary the data from press releases from Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Soon we'll all be able to look at the data in much more detail. But assuming that top line data is also reflects when we look sort of below the surface, having a vaccine that is a one-dose refrigerator stable vaccine that can keep you out of the hospital or keep you from seeking medical attention is of tremendous value. I think, when you look at and remember also, these studies aren't done side by side. They're often done in different populations. The J&J trial was done not just in the US, but also in South Africa, in Latin America, and it's being evaluated by different investigators with different criteria. So I'd be curious to see what the effectiveness data is when these vaccines actually are tested post head-to-head after they're out there. But it's funny, if I told people, before, sort of 6 months ago, here's a vaccine that will prevent roughly 3 out of every 4 people in the United States from having moderate to severe disease, that no one, at least so far in the trials, who's been all the hospitalizations and deaths are in the placebo group, and it's one dose and it's refrigerator stable. I think people would have jumped at that chance. Now they're sort of saying, well, it's not as good against mild disease. It doesn't matter. I really don't think it matters. Again, we need to look at the data, but and I'd like to say one other thing, by the way. This FDA process is a transparent process. I mean, the company will submit its 80 to 100 pages of data that goes through all the trials. The FDA will look at all the clinical data. They'll look at all the records. They will create an 80 to 100 page document. Both of those documents will be on their website. So when we're reviewing the documents, you can review them too. And when that meeting occurs, which is on February 26th, it is live streamed. So you can watch it. And in fact, there's public comment. So nothing's behind closed doors here.
Just the last question on the international side. The Japanese have done a terrific job at controlling the disease, but they haven't started vaccinating, and there's a lot of vaccination resistance. So if someone is thinking of going to the Japan Olympics, how risky is it?
Well, if you're vaccinated, less risky. Although remember, it's here. There was a study done in Norway actually years ago, like 1999, 2000, and obviously you were at the least risk of getting measles if you were vaccinated against measles, living in a highly vaccinated community. But you were actually at greater risk of measles if you were vaccinated, living in an unvaccinated community, than if you were unvaccinated, living in a highly vaccinated community. The reason this is no vaccine is 100% effective. If there's a lot of the virus around you, then you're at some risk. So if you're going to be sitting in a population of people who are unvaccinated, it's always risky.
Wow. Well, I thank you very much for this. I think the message we come out of this with is up the production, figure out a way for warp speed 2 so the vaccine can be mass produced globally and the third world can get its fair share. And don't lose hope. The vaccine probably will be coming to someplace near you sometime soon. I want to thank everybody for joining our webinar today, especially, obviously, Dr. Offit. And we hope you enjoyed the content, and I hope you will tune in for my next Inquirer Live event on Friday, March 5th, also at 11 a.m., on After the Capitol Riot, dealing with domestic terrorism and far-right infiltration of the military, the challenges at home, and what we can learn from the German experience. The speakers will be Cynthia Miller-Idriss, author of Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, and Daniel Kohler, who's director of the German Institute on Radicalization and De-Radicalization Studies in Stuttgart. And the Germans have had some very interesting experiences with penetration by radicals of the military. So thank you again. And I just hope that some optimism is justified and hope to talk to you again in the future. Goodbye.